Chapter 46 of the Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. Chapter 46. The First Humbug in the World. Advantages of studying the impositions of former ages. Heathen humbugs. The ancient mysteries. The Kabiri. Eleusis. Isis. The domain of humbug reaches back to the Garden of Eden, where the father of lies practiced it upon our poor, innocent first grandmother, Eve. This was the first and worst of all humbugs. But from that eventful day to the present moment, falsehood, hypocrisy, deception, imposition, cant, bigotry, false appearances and false pretenses, superstitions, and all conceivable sorts of humbugs have had a full swing, and he or she who watches these things most closely and reflects most deeply upon these various peculiarities, bearings, and results will be best qualified to detect and avoid them. For this reason I should look upon myself as somewhat of a public benefactor in exposing the humbugs of the world, if I felt competent to do the subject full justice. Next to the fearful humbug practiced upon our first parents, came heathen humbugs generally. All heathenism and idolatry are one grand complex humbug to begin with. All the heathen religions always were, and are still, audacious, colossal, yet shallow and foolish humbugs. The heathen humbugs were played off by the priests, the shrewdest men then alive. It is a curious fact that the heathen humbugs were all solemn. This was because they were intended to maintain the existing religions, which, like all false religions, could not endure ridicule. They always appealed to the pious terrors of the public, as well as to its ignorance and appetite for marvels. They offered nothing pleasant, nothing to love, nothing to gladden the heart and lift it up in joyful gratitude, true adoration, and childlike confidence, prayer, and thanksgiving. On the contrary, awful noises, fearful sights, frightful threats, foaming at the mouth, dark sayings, secret processions, bloody sacrifices, grim priests, costly offerings, sleeps in darksome caverns to wait for a dream from the god. These were the machineries of the ancient heathen. They were as crude and as ferocious as those of the king of Dahomey, or of the barbarous Negroes of the Guinea coast. But they often show a cunning as keen and effective as that of any quack, or Philadelphia lawyer, or Davenport brother, or Jackson Davis of today. The most prominent of the heathen humbugs were the mysteries, the oracles, the sibyls. Nota bene, the word is often misspelled sibyls, and augury. Every respectable pagan religion has some mysteries, just as every respectable Christian family has a Bible, and as an ill-natured proverb has it, a skeleton. It was considered a poor religion, a one-horse religion, so to speak, that had no mysteries. The chief mysteries were those of the Kabiri, of Eleusis, and of Isis. These mysteries used exactly the same kind of machinery which proves so effective every day in modern mysteries, viz., shows, processions, voices, lights, dark rooms, frightful sights, solemn mummeries, striking costumes, big talks and preachments, threats, gabbles of nonsense, etc., etc. The mysteries of the Kabiri are the most ancient of which anything is known. These Kabiris were sort of a original old Dr. Jacob Townsend's of divinities. They were considered senior and superior to Jupiter, Neptune, Plato, and the gods of Olympus. They were Pelasgic, that is, they belonged to that unknown ancient people from whom both the Greek and the Latin nations are thought to have come. The Cabiri afterwards figured as the "elder gods" of Greece, the inventors of religion, and of the human race in fact, and were kept so very dark that it is not even known with any certainty who they were. The ancient heathen gods, like modern thieves, very usually objected to pass by their real names. The Cabiri were particularly at home in Lemnos, and afterward in Samothrace. Their mysteries were of a somewhat unpleasant character as far as we know them. The candidate had to pass a long time almost starved, and without any enjoyment whatever, was then let into a dark temple crowned with olive, tied around with a purple girdle, and frightened almost to death with horrid noises, terrible sights of some kind, great flashes of light and deep darkness between, etc., etc. There was a ceremony of absolution from past sin, and a formal beginning of a new life. It is a curious fact that this performance seems to have been a kind of pious marine insurance company, as the initiated, it was believed, could not be drowned. Perhaps they were put in a way to obtain a drier strangulation. The reason why these ceremonies were kept so successfully secret is plain. Each man, as he was let in and found what nonsense it was sure to hold his tongue and help the next man in, as in the modern case of the celebrated "Sons of Malta." It is to be admitted, however, to the credit of the Cabiri, that a doctrine of reformation, or of living a better practical life, seems to have been part of their religion. This is an interesting recognition, by heathen consciences, of one of the great moral truths which Christianity has enforced. Something of the same kind can be traced in other heathen mysteries. But these heathen attempts at virtue invariably rotted out into aggravations of vice. No religion except Christianity ever contained the principle of improvement in it. Bugaboos and hobgoblins may serve for a time to frighten the ignorant into obedience, but if they get a chance to cheat the devil, they will be sure to do it. Nothing but the great doctrine of Christian love and brotherhood, and of a kind and paternal divine government, has ever proved to be permanently reformatory, and tending to lift the heart above the vices and passions to which poor human nature is prone. The mysteries of Eleusis were celebrated every year at Eleusis near Athens, in honor of Ceres, and were a regular "May anniversary," so to speak, for the pious heathens of the period. It took just 9 days to complete them, long enough for a puppy to get its eyes open. The candidates were very handsomely put through. On the first day they got together, on the second they took a wash in the sea, on the third they had some ceremonies about Proserpine, on the fourth no mortal knows what they did, and on the fifth they marched around a temple, 2 and 2, with torches, like a wide-awake procession. And on the 6th, 7th, and 8th there were more processions, and the initiation proper, said to have been something like that of a Freemasonry, so that we may suppose the victims rode the goat and were broiled on the gridiron. On the 9th day the ceremony, they say, consisted in overturning 2 vessels of wine. I fear by this means that they all got drunk, and the more so because the coins of Eleusis have a hog on one side, as much as to say, we make hogs of ourselves. There was a set of mysteries at Athens, called Thesmophoria, and one at Rome, called the Mysteries of the Bona Dea, which were celebrated by married women only. Various notions prevailed as to what they did. But can there be any reasonable doubt about it? They were, I fear, systematic conspirators' meetings, in which the more experienced matrons instructed the junior ones on how to manage their husbands. If this was not their object, then it was to maintain the influence of the heathen clergy over the heathen ladies. Women have always been the constituents of priests where false religions prevailed, as they have, for better purposes, of the ministers of the gospel among Christians. The mysteries of the goddess Isis, which originated in Egypt, were in general like those of Ceres at Eleusis. The Persian mysteries of Mithra, which were very popular during part of the latter days of the Roman Empire, were of the same sort. So were those of Bacchus, Juno, Jupiter, and various other heathen gods. All of them were celebrated with great solemnity and secrecy. All included much that was terrifying, and all of their secrets have been so faithfully kept that we have only guesses and general statements about the details of the performances. Their principal object seems to have been to secure the initiated against misfortunes, and to gain prosperity in the future. Some have imagined that very wonderful and glorious truths were revealed in the midst of these heathen humbugs. But I guess that the more we find out about them, the bigger humbugs they will appear, as happened to the travelers who held a post-mortem on the great heathen god in the story. This was a certain very terrible and powerful divinity among some savage tribes, of whom dreadful stories were told, very authentic, of course. Some unbelieving scamps of travelers by unlawful ways managed to get into the innermost sacred place of the temple one night. They found the god to be done up in a very large and suspicious-looking bundle. Having sacrilegiously cut the string, they unrolled one envelope of mats and cloths after another, until they had taken off more than 100 wrappers. The god grew smaller and smaller and smaller, and the wonder of the travelers what he could be, larger and larger. At last the very innermost of all the coverings fell off, and the great heathen god was revealed in all his native majesty. It was a cracked soda-water bottle. This indicates what is beyond all question the fact that the heathen mysteries had their foundation in gas. Indeed, the whole composition of these impositions was gammon, deception, hypocrisy, humbug. Truly, the science of humbug is entitled to some consideration, simply for its antiquity, if for nothing else. End of chapter 46.
Of the Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by May Lowe. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. Chapter 47. Heathen Humbugs No. 2. Heathen Stated Services. Oracles. Sibyls. Auguries. Something must be said about the oracles, the sibyls, and the auguries, which, besides the mysteries elsewhere spoken of, were the chief assistant humbugs or sideshows used for keeping up the great humbug heathen religion. One word about the regular worship of heathenism, what may be called their stated services. They had no weekly day of worship, indeed no week, and no preaching such as ours is. That is, no regular instruction by the ministers of religion intended for all the people. They had singing and praying after their fashion, the singing being a sort of chant of praise to whatever idol was under treatment at the time, and the praying being in part vain repetitions of the name of their god, and for the rest a request that the god would do or give whatever was asked of him as a fair business transaction, in return for the agreeable smell of the fine beef they had just roasted under his nose, or for whatever else they had given him, as a sum of money, a pair of pantaloons, or whatever they wore instead, a handsome cup. This made the temple a regular shop, where the priests traded off promised benefits for real beef, coining blessings into cash on the nail, a very thorough humbug. Such public religious ceremonies as the heathen had were mostly annual, sometimes monthly. There were also daily ones, which were, however, the daily business of the priests, and none of the business of the laymen. To return to the subject. All the heathen oracles, old and new, for abundance of them are still a-going, sibyls, auguries, and all, show how universally and naturally, and humbly and helplessly too, poor human nature longs to see into the future, and longs for help and guidance from some power higher than itself. Thus considered, these shallow humbugs teach a useful lesson, for they constitute a strong proof of man's inborn natural recognition of some God, of some obligation to a higher power, of some disembodied existence, and so they show a natural human want of exactly what the Christian revelation supplies, and constitute a powerful evidence for Christianity. All the heathen religions, I believe, had oracles of some kind, but the Greek and Latin ones tell the whole story. Of these, there were over 100, more than 20 of Apollo, who was the god of soothsaying, divination, prophecy, and of the supernatural side of heathen humbug generally, 30 or 40 collectively of Jupiter, Ceres, Mercury, Pluto, Juno, Ino, a very good name for a goddess that gave oracles, though she didn't know, Faunus, Fortune, Mars, etc., and nearly as many of demigods, heroes, giants, etc., such as Amphiaraus, Amphilochus, Trophonius, Geryon, Ulysses, Calchas, Aesculapius, Hercules, Pasiphae, Phrixus, etc. The most celebrated and most patronized of them all was the great oracle of Apollo at Delphi. The little fee appears to have been the only universal characteristic of the proceedings for obtaining an answer from the god. Whether you got your reply in words spoken by the rattling of an old pot, by observing an ox's appetite, throwing dice, or sleeping for a dream, your own proceedings were essentially the same. Terms invariably net cash in advance, or its equivalent. A fine ox or sheep sacrificed was cash, for after the god had had his smell, those ladies and gentlemen appear to have eaten, as they say the Yankees talk, through their noses. All the rest was put carefully away by the reverend clergy for dinner, and saved so much on the butcher's bill. If your credit was good, you might receive your oracle, and afterwards send in any little acknowledgment in the form of a golden goblet, or statue, or vase, or even of a remittance in specie. Such gifts accumulated in the oracle at Delphi, and to an immense amount, and to the great emolument of Brennus, a matter-of-fact Gaulish commander, who, at his invasion of Greece, coolly carried off all the bullion, without any regard to the screeches of the Pythoness, and with no more scruples than any burglar. The Delphinian oracle worked through a woman who, on certain days, went and sat on a 3-legged stool over a hole in the ground in Apollo's temple. This hole sent out gas, which, instead of being used like that afforded by holes in the ground at Fredonia, New York, to illuminate the village, was much more shrewdly employed by the clerical gentlemen to shine up the knowledge boxes of their customers, and introduce the glitter of gold into their own pockets. I merely throw out the hint to any speculating Fredonian who owns a hole in the ground. Well, the Pythia, as this female was termed, warmed up her understanding over this hole, as you have seen ladies do over the register of a hot air furnace, and becoming excited, she presently began to be drunk or crazy, and in her fit she gabbled forth some words or noises. These the priests took down, and then told the customer that the noises meant so-and-so. When business was brisk, they worked 2 Pythias, turn and turn about, or, as they say at sea, watch and watch, and kept a 3rd all cocked and primed in case of accident, besides, for this gas sometimes gave the priestess, literally, fits, which killed her in a few days. Other oracles gave answers in many various ways. The priest quietly wrote down whatever answer he chose, or inspected the insides of a slaughtered beast, and said that the bowels meant this and that. At Telmessus, the inquirer peeped into a well, where he must see a picture in the water, which was his answer. At any rate, if this wouldn't do, he got none. The plan was evidently based on the idea that truth is at the bottom of a well. At Dodona, they hung brass pots on the trees, and translated the banging these made when the wind blew them together. At Pherae, you whispered your question in the ear of the image of Mercury, and then shutting your ears until you got out of the marketplace, the first remark you heard from anybody was the answer, and you might make the best of it. At Pluto's oracle at Charae, the priest took a dream, and in the morning told you what he chose. In the cave of Trophonius, after various terrifying performances, they pulled you through a hole the wrong way of the feathers, and then back again, and then stuck you upon a seat, and made you write down your own oracle, being what you had seen, which would, I imagine, usually be the elephant, and so forth, and so on, humbug ad libitum. Like some of the more celebrated modern fortune-tellers, the managers of the oracles were frequently shrewd fellows, and could often pick up the materials of a very smart and judicious answer from the appearance of the customer and his question. Very often the answer was sheer nonsense. It was, in fact, believed by many that as a rule you couldn't tell what the response meant until after it was fulfilled, when you were expected to see it. In many cases the answers were ingeniously arranged, so as to mean either a good or evil result, one of which was pretty likely. Thus, one of the oracles answered a general who asked after the fate of his campaign as follows, the ancients, remember, using no punctuation marks: "Thou shalt go, thou shalt return, never in war shalt thou perish." The point becomes visible when you first make a pause before never, and then after it. On a similar occasion, the Delphic oracle told Croesus that if he crossed the river Halys, he would overthrow a great empire. This empire he chose to understand as that of Cyrus, whom he was going to fight. It came out the other way, and it was his own empire that was overthrown. The immense wisdom of the oracle, however, was tremendously respected in consequence. Pyrrhus, of Epirus, on setting off against the Romans, received equal satisfaction, the Pythia telling him, in Latin, what amounted to this: "I say that you, Pyrrhus, the Romans are able to conquer." Pyrrhus took it as he wished, but found himself sadly thimble-rigged, the little joker being under the wrong cup. The Romans beat him, and most woefully too. Trajan was advised to consult the oracle at Heliopolis about his intended expedition against the Parthians. The custom was to send your query in a letter, so Trajan sent a blank note in an envelope. The god, very naturally, sent back a blank note in reply, which was thought wonderfully smart. And so the imperial dupe sent again a square question: "Shall I finish this war and get safe back to Rome?" The Heliopolitan humbug replied by sending a piece of an old grapevine cut into pieces, which meant either "you will cut them up," or "they will cut you up." And Trajan, like the little boy at the peep show who asked, "Which is Lord Wellington and which is the Emperor Napoleon?" had paid his penny and might take his choice. Sometimes the oracles were quite jocular. A man asked one of them how to get rich. The oracle said, "Own all there is between Sicyon and Corinth," which places are some 15 miles apart. Another fellow asked how he should cure his gout. The oracle coolly said, "Drink nothing but cold water." The Delphic oracle, and some of the others, used for a long time to give their answers in verses. At last, however, irreverent critics of the period made so much fun of the peculiarly miserable style of this poetry that the poor oracle gave it up and came down to plain prose. Every once in a while, some energetic and cunning man, of sceptical character, insisted on having just such an answer as he wanted. It was well known that Philip of Macedon bought what responses he wished at Delphi. Anybody with plenty of money, who could quietly see the priests, could have such a response as he chose. Or, if he was a bull-headed, hard-fisted, fighting man, of irreligious but energetic mind, the priests gave him what he wished, out of fear. When Themistocles wanted to encourage the Greeks against the Persians, he fixed Delphi by bribes. When Alexander the Great came to consult the same oracle, the Pythia was disinclined to perform. But Alexander rather roughly gave her to understand that she must, and she did. The Greek and Roman oracles finally all gave out, not far from the time of Christ's coming, having gradually become more or less disreputable for many years. All the heathen nations, as I have said, had their oracles too. The heathen Scandinavians had a famous one at Upsal. The Getae in Scythia had one, the Druids had them, so did the Mexican priests. The Egyptian and Syrian divinities had them. In short, oracles were quite as necessary as mysteries, and continue so in heathen religions. The only exception, I believe, is in Mohammedanism, whose votaries save themselves any trouble about the future by their thorough fatalism. They believe so fully and vividly that everything is immovably predestinated, being at the same time perfectly sure of heaven at last, that they quietly receive everything as it comes, and don't take the least trouble to find out how it is coming. The Sibyls were women, supposed to be inspired by some divinity, who were prophesied of the future. Some say there was but one, some 2, 3, 4, or 10. All sorts of obscure stories are told about the time and place of their activity. There was the Persian or the Chaldean, who is said to have foretold with many details the coming and career of Christ. The Libyan, the Delphic, the Cumaean, much honoured by the Romans, and half a dozen more. Then there was Mantho, the daughter of Tiresias, who was sent from Thebes to Delphi in a bag 720 years before the destruction of Troy. These ladies lived in caves, and among them are said to have composed the Sibylline books, which contain the mysteries of religion, were carefully kept out of sight at Rome, and finally came into the hands of the Emperor Constantine. They were burned, one story has it, about 50 years after his death, but there are some Sibylline books extant, which, however, are among the most transparent of humbugs, for they are full of all sorts of extracts and statements from the Old and New Testaments. I do not believe that there ever were any Sibyls. If there were any, they were probably ill-natured and desperate old maids, who turned so sour-tempered that their friends had to drive them off to live by themselves, and who, under these circumstances, went to work and wrote books. I must crowd in here a word or two about the auguries and the augurs. These gentlemen were a sort of Roman priests, who were accustomed to foretell future events, decide on coming good or bad fortune, whether it would do to go on with the elections, to begin any enterprise or not, etc., by means of various signs. These were thunder, the way any birds happened to fly, the way that the sacred chickens ate, the appearance of the entrails of beasts sacrificed, etc., etc. These augurs were, for a long time, much respected in Rome, but at last the more thoughtful people lost their belief in them, and they became so ridiculous that Cicero, who was himself one of them, said he could not see how one augur could look another in the face without laughing. It is humiliating to reflect how long and how extensively such barefaced and monstrous humbugs as these have maintained unquestioned authority over almost the whole race of man. Nor has humanity by any means escaped from such debasing slavery now, for millions and millions of men still believe and practice forms and ceremonies even more absurd, if possible, than the mysteries, oracles, and auguries. End of chapter 47.
48 of the Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. Chapter 48. Modern Heathen Humbugs. A scale of superstition and religious beliefs of today, arranged from the lowest to the highest, would show many curious coincidences with another scale, which should trace the history of superstitions and religious beliefs backward in time toward the origin of man. Thus, for instance, the heathen humbugs, whether revolting or ridiculous, which I am to speak of in this chapter are in full blast today, and they furnish perfect specimens of the beliefs which prevailed among the heathen of 4,000 and of 1,800 years ago, of the Chaldean Canaanite superstitions, and equally of those of the Romans under Augustus Caesar. The most dirty, vulgar, low, silly, and absurd of all the superstitions in the world are, as is natural, those of the darkest minded of all the heathen who have any superstition at all. For, as if for the humiliation of our proud human nature, there are really some human beings who seem to have too little intellect even to rise to the height of a superstition. Such are the Andaman Islanders, who crawl on all fours, wear nothing but a plaster of mud to keep the mosquitoes off, eat bugs and grubs and ants, and turn their children out to shift for themselves as soon as the little wretches can learn to crawl and eat bugs. The lowest of superstitions are fetishism and obi, believed and practiced by Negro tribes, and remember this, even by their ignorant white mistresses in the West Indies and in the United States today. Yes, I know where Southern refugee secessionist women are living in and about New York City at this moment, who really believe in the Negro witchcraft called obi, practiced by the slaves. A fetish is anything not a living being, worshipped because supposed to be inhabited by some god. In some parts of Africa, the fetishes are a sort of guardian divinity, and there is one for each district, like a town constable, and sometimes one for each family. The fetish is any stone picked up in the street, a tree, a chip, a rag. It may be some stone or wooden image, an old pot, a knife, a feather. Before this precious divinity the poor darkies bow down and worship, and sometimes sacrifice a sheep or a rooster. Each more important fetish has a priest, and here is where the humbug comes in. This gentleman lives on the offerings made to the fetish, and he exploits his god, as a Frenchman would say, with great profit. Obi, or obeah, is the name of the witchcraft of the Negro tribes, and the practitioner is termed an obi man or obi woman. They practice it at home in Africa, and carry it with them to continue it when they are made slaves in other lands. Obi is now practiced, as I already hinted, in Cuba and in the Southern States, and is believed in by the more ignorant and foolish white people, as much as by their barbarous slaves. Obi is used only to injure, and the way to perform it upon your enemy is to hire the obi man or woman to concoct a charm, and then to hide this, or cause it to be hidden, in some place about the person or abode of the victim where he will find it. He is expected thereupon to fall ill, to wither and waste away, and so to die. Absurd as it may seem, this cursing business operates with a good deal of certainty on the poor Negroes, who fall sick instantly on finding the ball of obi, 2 or 3 inches in diameter, hidden in their bed, or in the roof, under the threshold, or in the earthen floor of their huts. These poor wretches become dejected, lose appetite, strength, and spirits, grow thin and ill, and really wither away and die. It is a curious fact, however, that if under these circumstances you can cause one of them to become converted to Christianity, or to become a Christian by profession, he becomes at once free from the witch's dominion and quickly recovers. The ball of obi, or as it is called among the Brazilian Negroes, mandinga, may be made of various materials, always, I believe, including some which are disgusting or horrible. Leaves of trees and scraps of rag may be used, ashes, usually from bones or flesh of some kind, pieces of cats' bones and skulls, feathers, hair, earth, or clay, which ought to be from a grave, teeth of men and of snakes, alligators or other beasts, vegetable gum or other sticky stuff, human blood, pieces of eggshell, etc., etc. This mixture is curiously like that in the witch's cauldron in Macbeth, which, among other equally toothsome matters, contained frogs' toes, bats' wool, lizards' legs, owlets' wings, wolf's teeth, witch's mummy, Jew's liver, tiger's bowels, and lastly, as a sort of thickening to the gravy, baboon's blood. A Creole lady now at the North recently told a friend of mine that the Negroes can put some pieces of paper or powder or something or other in your shoes that will make you sick or make you do anything they want. This poor foolish woman told this with a face full of awe and eyes wide open. Another lady known to me, long resident at the South, tells me that the belief in this sort of devilism is often found among the white people. The practices called Vaudoux or Voodoo are a sort of obi, being, like that, an invoking of the aid of some god to do what the worshippers wish. The voodoo humbug is quite prevalent in Cuba, Haiti, and other West India islands, where there are wild Negroes or where they are still imported from Africa. There is also a good deal of this sort of humbug among the slaves in New Orleans, and cases arising from it have recently quite often appeared in the police reports in the newspapers of that city. The voodoo worshippers assemble secretly, with a kind of chief witch or mistress of ceremonies. There is a boiling cauldron of hell broth, a la Macbeth. The votaries dance naked around their soup. Amulets and charms are made and distributed. During a quarter of a century last past, some hundreds of these orgies have been broken up by the New Orleans police, and probably as many more have come off as per program. The voodoo processes are most frequently appealed to for the purposes of some unsuccessful or jealous lover, and the Creole ladies believe in voodooism as much as in obi. In the West Indies, the voodoo orgies are more savage than in this country. It is but a little while since in Haiti, under the energetic and sensible administration of President Giffard, 8 voodoo worshippers were regularly tried and executed for having murdered a young girl, the niece of 2 of them, by way of human sacrifice to the god. They tied the poor child tight, put her in a box called a humfort, fed her with some kind of stuff for 4 days, and then deliberately strangled her, beheaded her, flayed her, and cooked the head with yams, ate of the soup, and then performed a solemn dance and chant around an altar with the skull on it. The Caffres in southern Africa have a kind of humbug somewhat like the Obi men, who are known as rainmakers. These gentlemen furnish what blessing and cursing may be required for other purposes, but as that country is liable to tremendous droughts, their best business is to make rain. This they do by various prayers and ceremonies, of which the most important part is receiving a large fee in advance from the customer. The rain-making business, though very lucrative, is not without its disadvantages, for whenever Musalakatsi or Dingan or any other chief sets his rainmaker at work, and the rain was not forthcoming as per application, the indignant ruler caused an assegai or 2 to be stuck through the wizard, for the encouragement of the other wizards. This was not so unreasonable as it may seem, for if the man could not make rain when it was wanted, what was he good for? The ceremonies of the powwows or medicine men of the North American Indians are less brutal than the African ones. These soothsayers, like the Obi men, prepared charms for their customers, usually, however, not so much to destroy others as to protect the wearer. These charms consist of some trifling matters tied up in a small bag, the medicine bag, which is to be worn around the neck, and will, it is supposed, ensure the wearer the special help and protection of the Great Spirit. The powwows sometimes do a little in the cursing line. There is a funny story of a Puritan minister in the early times of New England who coolly defied one of the most famous Indian magicians to play off his infernal artillery. A formal meeting was had, and the powwow rattled his traps, howled, danced, blew feathers, and vociferated jargon till he was perfectly exhausted, the old minister quietly looking at him all the time. The savage humbug was dumbfounded, but quickly recovering his presence of mind, saved his home reputation by explaining to the red gentleman in the breech-cloths and nose-rings that the Yankees ate so much salt that curses wouldn't take hold on him at all. The shamans or shahamans of Siberia follow a very similar business, but are not so much priestly humbugs as mere conjurers. The lamas or Buddhist leaders of Central and Southern Asia are, however, regular priests again, and may be said with singular propriety to run their machine on principles of thorough religious humbug, for they do really pray by a machine. They set up a little mill to go by water or wind, which turns a cylinder. On this cylinder is written a prayer, and every time the barrel goes round once, it counts, they say, for one prayer. It may be imagined how piety intensified in a freshet, or in a heavy gale of wind. And there is a ludicrous notion of economy, as well as a pitiable folly in the conception of profiting by such windy supplications, and of saving all one's times and thoughts for business, while the prayers rattle out by the hundred at home. Only imagine the pious fervor of one of these priests in a first-class Lowell mill, of say 100,000 spindles. Print a large edition of some good prayer, and paste a copy on each spindle, and the place would seem to him the very gate of a Buddhist heaven. He would feel sure of taking heaven by storm, with a sustained fire of 100,000 prayers every second. His first requisite for a prosperous church would be a good water power for the prayer mills. And yet, absurd as these prayer mills of the heathen really are, it may not be safe to bring them under unqualified condemnation. For who among us has not sometimes heard windy prayers, even in our Christian churches? Young clergymen are especially liable, and I might say, prone to this mockery. These, however, are but exceptions to the general Christian rule, viz., that the Omniscient careth only for heart service, and that before him all mere lip service or machine service is simply an abomination. A less innocent kind of praying is one of the religious humbugs of the bloody and cruel Sandwich Islands form of heathenism. Here a practice prevailed, and does yet, of paying money to a priest to pray your enemy to death. For cash in advance, this bargain could always be made, and so groveling was the spiritual cowardice of these poor savages, that, like the negro victim of Obi, the man prayed at seldom failed to sicken as soon as he found out what was going on, and to waste away and die. This bit of heathen humbug, now in operation from so many distant portions of the earth, shows how radically similar is all heathenism. It shows, too, how mean, vulgar, filthy, and altogether vile is such religion as man, unassisted, contrives for himself. It shows again how sadly great is the proportion of the human race still remaining in this brutal darkness. And by contrast, it affords us great reason for thankfulness that we live in a land of better culture and happier hopes and practices. End of chapter 48.
9 of the Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. Chapter 49. Ordeals. Ordeals belong to times and communities of rudeness, violence, materialism, ignorance, gross superstition, and blind faith. The theory of ordeals is, that God will miraculously decide in the case of any accused person referred to him. He will cause the accused to be victorious or defeated in a duel, will punish him on the spot for perjury, and if the innocent be exposed to certain physical dangers, will preserve him harmless. The duel, for instance, used to be called the ordeal by battle, and was simply the commitment of the decision of a cause to God. Duels were regularly prefaced by the solemn prayer, "God show the right." Nowadays, nobody believes that skill with a pistol is going to be specially bestowed by the Almighty, without diligent practice at a mark. Accordingly, the idea of a divine interposition has long ago dropped out of the question, and dueling is exclusively in the hands of the devil and his human votaries, is a purely brutal absurdity. But in England, so long was this bloody, superstitious humbug kept up, that any hardened scoundrel who was a good hand at his weapon might, down to the year 1819, absolutely have committed murder under the protection of English law. 2 years before that date a country rough named Abraham Thornton murdered his sweetheart, Mary Ashford, but by deficiency of proof was acquitted on trial. There was, however, a moral conviction that Thornton had killed the girl, and her brother, a mere lad, caused an appeal to be entered according to the English statute, and Thornton was again arraigned before the King's Bench. In the meantime his counsel had looked up the obsolete proceedings about assize of battle, and when Thornton was placed at the bar, he threw down his glove upon the floor according to the ancient forms, and challenged his accuser to mortal combat. In reply, the appellant, Ashford, set forth facts so clearly showing Thornton's guilt as to constitute, as he alleged, cause for exemption from the combat, and for condemnation of the prisoner. The court, taken by surprise, spent 5 months in studying on the matter. At last it decided that the fighting man had the law of England on his side, admitted his demand, and further found that the matters alleged for exemption from combat were not sufficient. On this, poor William Ashford, who was but a boy, declined the combat by reason of his youth, and the prisoner was discharged, and walked in triumph out of court, the innocent blood still unavenged upon his hands. The old fogies of Parliament were startled at finding themselves actually permitting the practice of barbarisms abolished by the Greek Emperor Michael Palaeologus in 1259, and by the good King Louis IX of France in 1270. And 2 years afterwards, in 1819, the legal duel or assize of battle was by law abolished in England. It had been legal there for 5 centuries and a half, having been introduced by statute in 1261. Before that time, the ordeals by fire and by water were the regular legal ones in England. These were known even to the Anglo-Saxon law, being mentioned in the Code of Ina, A.D. about 700. It appears that fire was thought the most aristocratic element, for the ordeal by fire was used for nobles, and that by water for vulgarians and serfs. The operations were as follows. When one was accused of a crime, murder for instance, he had his choice whether to be tried by God and his country, or by God. If he chose the former, he went before a jury; if the latter, he underwent the ordeal. 9 red-hot ploughshares were laid on the ground in a row. The accused was blindfolded and sent to walk over them. If he burnt himself, he was guilty; if not, not. Sometimes, instead of this, the accused carried a piece of red-hot iron of from 1 to 3 pounds weight in his hand for a certain distance. The ordeal by water was, in one form at least, the same wise alternative in after years so often offered to witches. The accused was tied up in a heap, each arm to the other leg, and flung into water. If he floated, he was guilty, and must be killed. If he sank and drowned, he was innocent, but killed. Trial was therefore synonymous with execution. The nature of such alternatives shows how important it was to have a character above suspicion. Another mode was for the accused to plunge his bare arm into boiling water to the elbow. The arm was then instantly sealed up in bandages under charge of the clergy for 3 days. If it was then found perfectly well, the accused was acquitted. If not, he was found guilty. Another ordeal was expurgation or compurgation. It was a simple business, as easy as swearing, very much like a custom house oath. It was only this: the accused made solemn oath that he was not guilty, and all the respectable men he could muster came and made their solemn oath that they believed so too. This is much like the jurisprudence of the Dutch justice of the peace in the old story, before whom 2 men swore that they saw the prisoner steal chickens. The thief, however, getting a little time to collect testimony, brought in 12 men who swore that they did not see him take the chickens. "Balance of evidence overwhelmingly in favor of the prisoner," said the sapient justice, in Dutch, I suppose, and finding him innocent in a ratio of 6 to 1, he discharged him at once. This ordeal by oath was reserved for people of eminence, whose word went for something, and who had a good many thorough-going friends. Another sort of ordeal was reserved for priests. It was called corsned. The priest who took the ordeal by corsned received a bit of bread or a bit of cheese, which was loaded heavily, by way of sauce, with curses upon whomsoever should eat it falsely. This he ate, together with the bread of the Lord's Supper. Everybody knew that if he were guilty, the sacred mouthful would choke him to death on the spot. History records no instance of the choking of any priest in this ordeal, but there is a story that the Saxon Earl Godwin of Kent took the corsned to clear himself of a charge of murder, and, being a layman, was choked. I fully believe that Earl Godwin is dead, for he was born about the year 1000, but I have not the least idea that corsned killed him. The priests had the management of ordeals, which, being appeals to God, were reckoned religious ceremonies. They of course much preferred the swearing and eating and hot iron and water ordeals, which could be kept under the regulation of clerical good sense. Not so with the ordeal by battle. No priest could do anything with the wrath of 2 great mad ugly brutes, hot to kill each other, and crazy to risk having their own throats cut or skulls cleft rather than not have the chance. In consequence, the whole influence of the Romish Church went against the ordeal by battle, and in favor of the others. Thus the former soon lost its religious element and became the mere duel, a base indulgence of a beast's passion for murder and revenge. The progress of enlightenment gradually pushed ordeals out of court. Mobs have, however, always tried the ordeal by water on witches. Almost all the heathen ordeals have depended on fire, water, or something to eat or drink. Even in the Bible we find an ordeal prescribed to the Jews (Numbers chapter 5) for an unfaithful wife, who was there directed to drink some water with certain ceremonies, which drink, God promises, shall cause a fatal disease if she be guilty, and if not, not. It is worth noticing that Moses says not a word about any water of jealousy or any other ordeal for unfaithful husbands. This drinking or eating ordeal prevails quite extensively even now. In Hindustan, theft is often enquired into by causing the suspected party to chew some dry rice or rice flour, which has some very strong curses stirred into it, corsned fashion. After chewing, the accused spits out his mouthful, and if it is either dry or bloody, he is guilty. It is easy to see how a rascal, if as credulous as rascals often are, would be so frightened that his mouth would be dry, and would thus betray his own peccadillo. Another Hindu mode was to give a certain quantity of poison in butter, and if it did no harm, to acquit. Here the man who mixes the dose is evidently the important person. In Madagascar they give some tangina water. Now tangina is a fruit, of which a little vomits a patient, and a good deal poisons or kills him, a quality which sufficiently explains how they managed that ordeal. Ordeals by fire and water are still practiced, with some variations, in Hindustan, China, Pegu, Siberia, Congo, Guinea, Senegambia, and other pagan nations. Some of those still in use are odd enough. A Malabar one is to swim across a certain river which is full of crocodiles. A Hindu one is for the two parties to an accusation to stand outdoors, each with one bare leg in a hole, he to win who can longest endure the bites they are sure to get. This would be a famous method in some of the New Jersey and New York and Connecticut seashore lowlands I know of. The mosquitoes would decide cases both civil and criminal at a speed that would make a judge of the Supreme Court as dizzy as a humming top. Another Hindu plan was for the accused to hold his head under water while a man walked a certain distance. If the walker chose to be lazy about it, or the prisoner had diseased lungs, this would be a rather severe method. The Wanakas in eastern Africa draw a red-hot needle through the culprit's lips, a most judicious place to get hold of an African, and if the wound bleeds he is guilty. In Siam, accuser and accused are put into a pen, and a tiger is let loose on them. He whom the tiger kills is guilty. If he kills both, both are guilty. If neither, then try another mode. Blackstone says that an ordeal might always be tried by attorney. I should think this would give the legal profession a very lively time whenever the courts were chiefly using tigers, poison, drowning, fire, and red-hot iron, but not so much so when a little swearing or eating was the only thing required. This whole business of ordeals is a singular superstition, and the extent of its employment shows how ready the human race is to believe that God is constantly influencing even their ordinary private affairs. In other words, it is in principle like the doctrine of special providence. Looked at as a superstition, however, considered as a humbug, the history of ordeals show how corrupt becomes the nuisance of religious ways of deciding secular business, and how proper is our great American principle of the separation of state and church. End of chapter 49.
The Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. Religious Humbugs. Chapter 50. Apollonius of Tyana. The annals of ancient history are peculiarly rich in narratives of pretension and imposition, and either owing to the greater ignorance and credulity of mankind, or the superior skill of gifted but unscrupulous men in those days, present a few examples that even surpass the most remarkable products of the modern science of humbug. One of their most surprising instances, in fact perhaps absolutely the leading impostor, was the sage or charlatan, for it is difficult to determine which, known as Apollonius Tyanius, so called from Tyana, in Cappadocia, Asia Minor, his birthplace, where he first saw the light about 4 years earlier than Christ, and consequently more than 18½ centuries ago. His arrival upon this planet was attended with some amazing demonstrations. With his first cry, a flash of lightning darted from the heavens to the earth and back again. Dogs howled, cats mewed, roosters crowed, and flocks of swans, so say the older chroniclers, probably geese every one of them, clapped their wings in the adjacent meadows with a supernatural clatter. Ushered into the world with such surprising omens as these, young Apollonius could not fail to make a noise himself ere long. Sent by his doting father to Tarsus, in Cilicia, to be educated, he found the dissipations of the place too much for him, and soon removed to Ægæ, a smaller city at no great distance from the other. There he adopted the doctrines of Pythagoras, and subjected himself to the regular discipline of that curious system whose first process was a sort of juvenile gag law, the pupils being required to keep perfectly silent for a period of 5 years, during which time it was forbidden to utter a single word. Even in those days few female scholars preferred this practice, and the boys had it all to themselves, nor were they by any means numerous. After this probation was over, they were enjoined to speak and argue with moderation. At Ægæ there stood a temple dedicated to Æsculapius, who figured on earth as a great physician and compounder of simples, and after death was made a god. The edifice was much larger and more splendid than the Brandreth House on Broadway, although we have no record of Aesculapius having bestowed upon the world any such benefaction as the universal pills. However, unlike our modern M.D.s, the latter was in the habit of reappearing after death in this temple, and there holding forth to the faithful on various topics of domestic medicine. Apollonius was allowed to take up his residence in the establishment, and no doubt the priests initiated him into all their dodges to impose upon the people. Another tenet of the Pythagorean faith was a total abstinence from beans, an arrangement which would be objectionable in New England and in Nassau street eating houses. Apollonius, however, who knew nothing of Yankees or Nassau street, manfully completed his novitiate. Restored at length to the use of beans and of his talking apparatus, he set forth upon a lecturing tour through Pamphylia and Cilicia. His themes were temperance, economy, and good behavior, and for the very novelty of the thing, crowds of disciples soon gathered about him. At the town of Aspenda he made a great hit, when he pitched into the corn merchants who had bought up all the grain during a period of scarcity and sold it to the people at exorbitant prices. Of course, such things are not permitted in our day. Apollonius, moved by the sufferings of women and children, took his stand in the marketplace, and with his stylus wrote in large characters upon a tablet the following advice to the speculators in grain. Quote, "The earth, the common mother of all, is just. But ye, being unjust, would make her a bountiful mother to yourselves alone. Leave off your dishonest traffic, or ye shall be no longer permitted to live." Unquote. The grain merchants, upon beholding this appeal, relented, for there was conscience in those days, and moreover the populace had prepared torches, and proposed to fry a few of the offenders, like oysters in breadcrumbs. So they yielded at once, and great was the fame of the prophet. Thus elevated in his own opinion, Apollonius, still preaching virtue by the wayside, set out for Babylon, after visiting the cities of Antioch, Ephesus, etc., always attracting immense crowds. As he penetrated further toward the remote east, his troops of followers fell off, until he was left with only 3 companions, who went with him to the end. One of these was a certain Damas, who wrote a description of the journey, and, by the way, tells us that his master spoke all languages, even those of the animals. We have men in our own country who can talk horse talk at the races, but probably none so perfectly as this great Tyanean. The author of The Ruined Cities of Africa, a recent publication, informs us that at Lamba, an African village, there is a leopard who can speak. This would go to show that the animals are aspiring in a direction directly the opposite of the acquirements of Apollonius, and I shall secure that leopard, if possible, for exhibition in the museum, and for a considerable consideration send him to any public meeting where someone is needed who will come up to the scratch. But to resume. On his way to Babylon, Apollonius saw by the roadside a lioness and 8 whelps, where they had been killed by a party of hunters, and argued from the omen that he should remain in that city just 1 year and 8 months, which of course turned out to be exactly the case. The Babylonian monarch was so delighted with the eloquence and skill of the noted stranger, that he promised him any 12 gifts that he might choose to ask for, but Apollonius declined accepting anything but food and raiment. However, the king gave him camels and escort to assist his journey over the northern mountains of Hindustan, which he crossed, and entered the ancient city of Taxilia. On the way he had a high time in the gorges of the hills with a horrible hobgoblin of the species called Empusa by the Greeks. This demon terrified his companions half out of their wits, but Apollonius bravely assailed him with all sorts of hard words, and, to literally translate the old Greek narrative, blackguarded him so effectually that the poor devil fled with his tail between his legs. At Taxilia, Phraortes, the king, a lineal descendant of the famous Porus, and truly a porous personage, since he was renowned for drinking, gave the philosopher a grand reception, and introduced him to the chief of the Brahmins, whose temples he explored. These Hindu gentlemen opened the eyes of Apollonius wider than they had ever been before, and taught him a few things he had never dreamed of, but which served him admirably during his latter career. He returned to Europe by way of the Red Sea, passing through Ephesus, where he vehemently denounced the speculators in gold and other improper persons. As they did not heed him, he predicted the plague, and left for Smyrna. Sure enough, the pestilence broke out just after his departure, and the Ephesians telegraphed to Smyrna, by the only means in their power, for his immediate return, gold in the meanwhile falling at least 10%. Apollonius reappeared in the twinkling of an eye, suddenly, in the very midst of the wailing crowd on the market-place. Pointing to a beggar, he directed the people to stone that particular unfortunate, and they obeyed so effectually that the hapless creature was in a few moments completely buried under a huge heap of brickbats. The next morning the philosopher commanded the throng to remove the pile of stones, and as they did so, a dog was discovered instead of the beggar. The dog sprang up, wagged his tail, and made away at 2:40, and with him the pestilence departed. For this feat the Ephesians called Apollonius a god, and reared a statue to his honor. The appellation of divinity he willingly accepted, declaring that it was only justice to good men. In these degenerate days we have accorded the term to only one person, the divine Fanny Elsler. That, too, was a tribute to superior understanding. Our hero next visited Pergamus, the site of ancient Troy, where he shut himself up all night in the tomb of Achilles, and having raised the great departed, held conversation with him on a variety of military topics. Among other things, Achilles told him that the theory of his having been killed by a wound in the heel was all nonsense, as he had really died from being bitten by a puppy in the back. If the reader does not believe me, let him consult the original manuscript of Damis. The same accident has disabled several great generals in modern times. Apollonius next made a tour through Greece, visiting Athens, Sparta, Olympia, and other cities, and exhorting the dissolute Greeks to mend their evil courses. The Spartans particularly came in for a severe lecture on the advantages of soap and water, and it is said that the first clean face ever seen in that republic was the result of the great Tyanean's teachings. At Athens he cured a man possessed of a demon, the latter bouncing out of his victim at length with such fury and velocity as to dash down a neighbouring marble statue. The Isle of Crete was the next point on the journey. With an earthquake occurring at the time, Apollonius suddenly exclaimed in the streets, "The earth is bringing forth land." Folks looked as he pointed toward the sea, and there beheld a new island in the direction of Terrae. He arrived at Rome, whither his fame had preceded him just as the Emperor Nero had issued an edict against all who dealt in magic, and although he knew that he was included in the denunciation, he boldly went to the Forum, where he restored to life the dead body of a beautiful lady, and predicted an eclipse of the sun, which shortly occurred. Nero caused him to be arrested, loaded with chains, and flung into an underground dungeon. When his jailers next made their rounds, they found the chains broken and the cell empty, but heard the chanting of invisible angels. This story would not be believed by the head jailer at Sing Sing. Prolonging his trip as far as Spain, Apollonius there got up a sedition against the authority of Nero, and thence crossed over into Africa. This was the darkest period of his history. From Africa he proceeded to the south of Italy and the island of Sicily, still discoursing as he went. About this time he heard of Nero's death, and returned to Egypt, where Vespasian was endeavoring to establish his authority. While in Egypt he explored the supposed sources of the Nile, and learned all the lore of the Ethiopian necromancers, who could do anything, even to making a black man white, thus greatly excelling the skill of after ages. Vespasian had immense faith in the Tyanean sage, and consulted him upon the most important matters of state. Titus, the successor of that monarch, manifested equal confidence, and regarded him absolutely as an oracle. Apollonius, who really seems to have been a most sensible politician, wrote the following brief but pithy note to Titus, when the latter modestly refused the crown of victory after having destroyed Jerusalem. Apollonius to Titus, Emperor of Rome, sendeth greeting. Since you have refused to be applauded for bloodshed and victory in war, I send you the crown of moderation. You know to what kind of merit crowns are due. Yet Apollonius was by no means an ultra peace man, for he strongly advocated the shaving and clothing of the Ethiopians, and their thorough chastisement when they refused to be combed and purified. When Domitian grasped at the imperial scepter, the great Tyanean sided with his rival, Nerva, and having for this offense been seized and cast into prison, suddenly vanished from sight, and reappeared on the instant at Puteoli, 150 miles away. The distinguished Mr. Jewett, of Colorado, is the only instance of similar rapidity of locomotion known to us in this country and time. After taking breath at Puteoli, the sage resumed his travels and revisited Greece, Asia Minor, etc. At Ephesus he established his celebrated school, and then, once more returning to Crete, happened to give his old friends, the Cretans, great offence, and was shut up in the temple Dictymna to be devoured by famished dogs, but the next morning was found perfectly unharmed in the midst of the docile animals, who had already made considerable progress in the Pythagorean philosophy, and were gathered around the philosopher, seated on their hind legs, with open mouths and lolling tongues, intently listening to him while he lectured them in the canine tongue. So devoted had they become to their eloquent instructor, and so enraged were they at the interruption when the Cretans reopened the temple, that they rushed out upon the latter and made a breakfast of a few of the leading men. This is one of the last of the remarkable incidents that we find recorded of the almighty Apollonius. How he came to his end is quite uncertain, but some veracious chroniclers declare that he simply dried up and blew away. Others aver that he lived to the good old age of 97, and then quietly gave up the ghost at Tyana, where a temple was dedicated to his memory. However that may be, he was subsequently worshipped with divine honors, and so highly esteemed by the greatest men of after days, that even Aurelian refused to sack Tyana out of respect to the philosopher's ashes. Dion Cassius, the historian, records one of the most remarkable instances of his clairvoyance or second sight. He states that Apollonius, in the midst of a discourse at Ephesus, suddenly paused, and then in a different voice exclaimed to the astonishment of all, "Have courage, good Stephanus! Strike! Strike! Kill the tyrant!" On that same day the hated Domitian was assassinated at Rome by a man named Stephanus. The humdrum interpretation of this "miracle" is simply that Apollonius had a foreknowledge of the intended attempt upon the tyrant's life. Long afterwards Cagliostro claimed that he had been a fellow traveller with Apollonius, and that his mysterious companion, the sage Athlotas, was the very same personage, who, consequently at the same time, must have reached the ripe age of some 1784 years, a lapse of time beyond the memory of even the oldest inhabitant, in these parts at least. The End. End of Chapter 50. End of The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum.